Welcome to the Cozy Book Corner. The book I'll be reading today is Anne of Green Gables. And you can see the theme. Anne loves nature, flowers, the china. It's vintage. It's a bit old-fashioned. Would you like a cup of tea? Yeah, me too. Sugar? Steaming hot. Here you go. Good. Chapter 1. Mrs. Rachel Lynde lived in a small village in the country. She liked to sit at her window and watch everybody pass by. She knew almost as much about their lives as they did. One afternoon in early June, she went to see her neighbor, Marilla Cuthbert, who lived at Green Gables. "Good evening, Rachel," Marilla said. "How is your family?" "We're all well," said Mrs. Lynde. "And how is your brother Matthew?" "Oh, he's quite well," she said. "He's gone to Bright River. We're getting a little boy from a children's home in Hopeton, and he's coming on the train tonight." Mrs. Lynde was so surprised that she could not speak for a minute. "We've been thinking about it for some time," said Marilla. "We thought we'd get a boy. Matthew isn't young, and he needs help on the farm. We'll give him a good home and send him to school." "Well, Marilla," Mrs. Lynde said, "I think you're doing a very foolish thing. You're bringing a strange child into your home." "Matthew wants to do it," Marilla said. "Well, I hope it will turn out right," said Mrs. Lynde. When Mrs. Lynde was walking home, she thought, "I feel sorry for the child. Matthew and Marilla don't know anything about children. I pity him. I really do." When Matthew Cuthbert reached the station, there was no sign of any train. The only person he could see was a young girl who seemed to be waiting for someone. He went to speak to the station master. "The 5:30 train has been in and left half an hour ago," the man said. "But there was a passenger left for you, a little girl. She's sitting out there." "I'm not expecting a girl," Matthew said. "I'm expecting a boy." There's Anne. Who's that? Is that Matthew? No. That is The station master. Dear Anne. This was actually your tea. But this is how it goes. Lovely. There must be a mistake, the station master said. Mrs. Spencer said that you and your sister were adopting the girl from a children's home. Matthew decided to go and speak to the girl. When he walked up to her, she said, "Are you Mr. Matthew Cuthbert of Green Gables? I'm very glad to see you. I was beginning to think you weren't coming for me." Matthew didn't want to say he had been expecting a boy, so he said, "I'm sorry I was late. Come with me. The horse is outside. Give me your bag." "Oh, I can't carry it," the child said. "It's got everything I own in it, but it isn't heavy." On the journey home, the girl talked all the time. Matthew, much to his own surprise, was enjoying himself. He did not usually like to be with women, but this child pleased him. "I hope I'm not talking too much," she said. "Oh, you can talk as much as you like," he told her. "Oh, I'm so glad. I know you and I are going to be friends. It feels good to talk when I want to. Too many times I've heard that children should be seen and not heard." They soon passed a house. "Mr. Barry lives there," Matthew said. "He's got a little girl called Diana. She's about 11. A few minutes later, he said, "We're almost home now. That's Green Gables over there." "Oh, I love it," she said. It's just how I thought it would be." Chapter 2. Marilla Cuthbert is surprised. When Marilla saw Matthew at the door with the little girl, she said, "Matthew Cuthbert, who is that? Where's the boy?" "There wasn't any boy," said Matthew. "There was only her." "No boy. But there must have been a boy," said Marilla. "We told Mrs. Spencer to bring a boy." The little girl heard this and cried out, "You don't want me? You don't want me because I'm not a boy? Nobody wants me. Oh, what shall I do?" And she began to cry. Well, there's no need to cry so about it," Marilla said. "What's your name?" The child thought for a moment. "Will you please call me Cordelia?" she asked. "Call you Cordelia? Is that your name?" "No, but I would love to be called Cordelia." "If Cordelia isn't your name, what is?" "Anne Shirley," said the child. "Anne is a good name. I like Cordelia better. But if you call me Anne, please call me Anne spelled with an E." "What difference does it make how it's spelled?" asked Marilla. "Oh, it makes such a difference. It looks so much nicer." "Very well then, Anne spelled with an E. You may stay tonight. Tomorrow we'll go and see Mrs. Spencer and find out how this mistake happened." Marilla took Anne to a small bedroom. The girl quickly undressed, put on the nightdress she had brought with her, and got into bed. Marilla said to Matthew later, "This girl will have to be sent back to the children's home." "Yes, I suppose so," said Matthew sadly. But she's a really nice little girl, Marilla. It's a pity to send her back when she wants to stay here. When Anne woke up the next morning, she could not remember where she was. Then she remembered. This was Green Gables, and they didn't want her because she wasn't a boy. She looked out of the window. It was such a beautiful place. She wished they would not send her away. Then Marilla came into the room. You better get dressed and come downstairs, she said. Breakfast is waiting. Wash your face and comb your hair. During the drive back to the station, Marilla said, It's 5 miles, and since you enjoy talking so much, you can tell me what you know about yourself. I was 11 last May, said Anne, and I was born in Bolingbroke, Nova Scotia. My father and mother were teachers. They were very poor, lived in a small yellow house in Bolingbroke. My mother died from a fever soon after I was born, and my father died 4 days later from a fever too. I lived with some people called Thomas until I was 8 years old and helped look after their other children. Then Mrs. Thomas was killed when he fell under a train. His mother offered to take Mrs. Thomas and the children, but she didn't want me. Then Mrs. Hammond from up the river came down and said she'd take me. And I went up to the river to live with her for 2 years and look after all her children. Then she died. Nobody wanted me, so I was put in a children's home. Were those women, Mrs. Thomas and Mrs. Hammond, good to you? Asked Marilla, looking at Anne. Oh, they meant to be. They had a lot to worry them, you know. Marilla asked no more questions. She felt sorry for Anne. The child had had a hard life, living with people who did not really want her. She began to think it was a pity the girl had to be sent back to the children's home. Chapter 3. Mrs. Rachel Lynde is not pleased. Marilla thought long and hard about keeping Anne. She knew that her brother wanted to keep her, and she saw that the girl was clever, even if she liked to dream. The next afternoon, Marilla said to the little girl, Sit down and listen. We have decided that you may stay here. You must go to school when it opens again in September. Oh, thank you, Anne said happily. What am I to call you? Can I call you Aunt Marilla? No, you call me just plain Marilla. I'd love to call you Aunt Marilla, said Anne. I've never had an aunt or even a grandmother. Can't I call you Aunt Marilla? No. Anne had been at Green Gables a fortnight before Mrs. Rachel Lynde came to see what she was like. You're not much to look at, Mrs. Lynde said. You're very thin and plain, and your face has freckles, and your hair is the color of carrots. I hate you, cried Anne. I hate you. I hate you. What a temper, cried Mrs. Lynde. Anne, go to your room and stay there until I come up, said Marilla. Anne ran to her room, crying. Afterward, Marilla went upstairs to talk to Anne. Mrs. Lynde had no right to call me ugly and red-headed, Anne cried. You had no right to get angry like that, said Marilla in a calm voice. You must go to Mrs. Lynde and tell her you are sorry. No, Anne said, I'm not sorry. The next morning, Matthew went to Anne's room. I think you should apologize to Mrs. Lynde, he said. Will you do that for me? Anne thought about this. She liked Matthew. She thought he was kind. All right, she said. I'll apologize. Good girl, Matthew said. Anna went downstairs and said to Marilla, I'm sorry I was rude to Mrs. Lynde. I'd like to apologize to her. Marilla was surprised, but also very pleased. They drove over to Mrs. Lynde's house. Anne fell to her knees in front of Mrs. Lynde. Please, Mrs. Lynde, forgive me for being so rude to you yesterday. I'm so very sorry. Can you find it in your heart ever to forgive me? Marilla thought Anne's apology was rather strange. Get up, child, said Mrs. Lynde. Of course I forgive you. I was a little hard on you. Now go into the garden and pick a few flowers for yourself. She's a strange girl, Mrs. Lynde said to Marilla, but she may turn out all right. I quite like her. On their way home, Anne said to Marilla, I apologized well, didn't I? Anne said no more until they turned into their own road. Then she said, It's lovely to be going home. I know it's home. I love Green Gables already, and I never loved any place before. Oh, Marilla, I'm so happy. When they arrived home, there was a letter from Mrs. Sperry inviting Marilla to bring Anne to meet her daughter, Diana. They went over that afternoon. Diana was a very pretty, happy little girl with her mother's black eyes and hair and red cheeks. Diana, said Mrs. Sperry, take Anne into the garden and show her your flowers. The berry garden was full of flowers. Anne loved it. She said to Diana, Oh, Diana, do you think you can like me enough to be your friend? Diana laughed. She always laughed before she spoke. Why, I think so, she said. It would be good to have somebody to play with. The two little girls walked about the garden. Anne felt happier than she had been for a very long time. Chapter 3. A storm in the school teapot. What a lovely day, said Anne, as she and Diana walked to school. The two girls always walked to school together. They walked through the trees and over the old bridge, talking all the time. The Emily School was a white building with old-fashioned desks. Behind it was a small stream where the children put their bottles of milk to keep it cool. Anne liked school very much, even though she was behind other students in the lessons. She had a better imagination than any of them. She also liked having other little girls to play with. In the class was a boy called Gilbert Blythe. He was tall, with brown hair, bright eyes, and a big smile. He was always playing tricks on the girls and making them laugh. One day, Anne was looking out of the window at the fields and trees. Suddenly, she felt a tug at her hair and heard Gilbert say, "Carrots! Carrots!" Anne was so angry. She jumped to her feet and shrack! She hit Gilbert on the head with her riding slate. Everybody cried, "Oh!" Mr. Phillips, the teacher, said, "Anne, go and stand in front of the blackboard for the rest of the afternoon." Anne stood in front of the blackboard all afternoon, feeling very angry. The next day she was in trouble with Mr. Phillips again for being late. "Anne," said Mr. Phillips, "go and sit next to Gilbert Blythe." This was the worst thing imaginable. Anne did not look at Gilbert at all, but he tried to talk to her and gave her some candy. She dropped it on the floor and crushed it with her shoe. Anne's mind was made up. She would not go to school to Mr. Phillips' class again. She told Marilla so. when she got home. "Nonsense," said Marilla. "You'll go to the school tomorrow as usual." But Anne was stubborn. Marilla did not know what to do, so she went to see Mrs. Lynde. "Well, Marilla," said Mrs. Lynde, happy that Marilla had come to her, "I think you should let her stay home for a while. She'll soon decide to go back to school." Marilla took Mrs. Lynde's advice and let Anne stay at home. Anne learned her lessons at home, helped around the house, and played with Diana. When she saw Gilbert Blythe, she passed him by with an icy look. Anne had decided to hate Gilbert Blythe to the end of her life. Chapter 5. Diana is invited to tea with terrible results. One afternoon, Marilla told Anne she could invite Diana over for tea. She could have some fruitcake, some jam, and some of the raspberry cordial in the cupboard. Anne ran down the road to Diana's house to ask her to tea. Diana came in her second best dress. She poured herself a glass of cordial and drank it. "That's very nice raspberry cordial, Anne," she said. "I'm happy you like it. Take as much as you want." And so Diana had 2 more glasses of cordial. Suddenly she turned pale. "I'm sick," she said. "I must go home." And she left Green Gables and ran all the way home. On Monday, Anne went to see if Diana was feeling better. She soon ran back home with tears rolling down her cheeks. "Whatever has happened, Anne?" asked Marilla. "Mrs. Barris says that I was sent Diana home drunk on Saturday. She says she's never, ever going to let Diana play with me again." Marilla went to the cupboard and then came back to the kitchen with a bottle of wine, trying to smile. "Anne, you gave Diana wine instead of raspberry cordial. Didn't you know the difference?" "I never tasted it," said Anne. "But Mrs. Barry will never believe me, and now I'll never be able to play with Diana again." The following Monday, Anne surprised Marilla by coming down from her room with her books. "I'm going back to school," she said. "That is all there is left in life for me, now that my friend is gone." Marilla tried to show how happy she was to hear this. "You'd better work hard," she said, and did work hard. And soon she was top of the class with Gilbert Blythe, whom she found very annoying. One evening, Anne was at home doing her homework. Matthew was home, but Marilla had gone to town with the Barris and Mrs. Lynde. Suddenly Anne looked up and saw Diana standing at the door. She looked very worried. "What is the matter, Diana?" cried Anne. "Oh, Anne, do come quick," said Diana nervously. "Minnie May is very sick. Father and Mother are away in town and there's nobody to go for the doctor." Matthew quietly got his cap and coat and went for the doctor. The 2 little girls ran to Diana's house, hand in hand. Minnie May was Diana's 3-year-old sister. She was very sick. Anne saw her and immediately went to work. She looked after so many children before, and she knew what to do. "First, we must have lots of hot water. Put the fire on. I'm going to give her some medicine." Minnie May did not like the medicine, but Anne did not give up. All night, Diana and Anne stayed with Minnie May. It was 3 o'clock when Matthew came with the doctor, but by then Minnie May was sleeping. Anne explained to the doctor what she had done. He was very impressed. Later on, he told Mr. and Mrs. Barry, "That little red-headed girl is very smart. She saved that baby's life." The next day at dinner, Marilla had something important to tell Anne. "Mrs. Barry was here this afternoon. She says you saved Minnie May's life. And she's very sorry she acted as she did about the wine. She says she's happy for you to play with Diana again." That night, Diana was invited to the Barrys for a lovely dinner. They all said wonderful things about her, and she felt very special. Chapter 6. A wonderful evening and a big surprise. One evening, Mrs. Barry said she would take Diana and Anne to their school's concert at the hall to celebrate Diana's birthday. She also said that Anne could stay there. Anne and Diana dressed in their very best clothes. Anne's clothes were not as pretty as Diana's, but she imagined that they were. They rode through the snow to the concert. The evening was very entertaining. There was only one performance that Anne did not enjoy, which was Gilbert Blythe's poetry reading. Anne picked up a library book and read it until he had finished. It was 11 when they got home. The house was dark and silent. The girls undressed in front of the fire and then ran to the spare room. They raced to see who could reach the bed first. They jumped onto the bed at the same moment. Then something moved. "Oh, goodness," said a voice. Anne and Diana jumped off the bed and ran away, very surprised. "Who was it?" whispered Anne. "It was Aunt Josephine," laughed Diana. "Oh, she will be so angry. How funny, Anne." The next morning, Anne left Diana's house very early. She saw her again in the afternoon. "Your Aunt Josephine was very angry, wasn't she?" said Anne. "Yes," answered Diana. "She said I was the worst behaved girl she ever saw. She says she won't stay at the house another night." "Well," said Anne, "I want to tell her that it was my fault." "No, Anne," said Diana, "she'll eat you alive." But Anne didn't listen. She walked into the house and knocked on the door of the sitting room. "Come in," said a voice. Miss Josephine Barry was knitting by the fire. "Who are you?" Miss Barry cried. "I'm Anne of Green Gables," said the small visitor, "and I've come to tell you the truth." "The truth about what?" "That it was all my fault jumping into the bed on you last night. We were only having fun. If you are going to be angry with me and not Diana. I'm used to it. I am sure you were frightened, but then so we. Could you imagine? We couldn't sleep in the spare room as we were promised." Miss Barry actually laughed. "I'm afraid it has been a long time since I used my imagination. Sit down here and tell me about yourself." "I am very sorry I can't," said Anne firmly. "I would like to, because you seem like an interesting lady, but I must go home to Marilla Cuthbert. I hope you will stay longer in Avonlea." "I think perhaps I will, if you'll come over and talk to me sometimes," said Miss Barry. That evening, Miss Barry decided to stay, just so that she could meet again with Anne. "She amuses me, and at my time of life, an amusing person is hard to find," she told Mr. and Mrs. Barry. Miss Barry stayed for more than a month. She and Anne soon became good friends. When Miss Barry went away, she asked Anne to visit her. "Remember," Miss Barry told Anne, "when you come to town and visit, you can stay in my very best spare room." Isn't it a good book? Anne is amazing. Brave little girl. Ah, yeah. An interesting cake. Anne had now been at Green Gables for a year. It was summer and an exciting time in the village. Mr. Phillips, the school teacher, was leaving, and there was a new minister for the church. Even more exciting was that he had a lovely young wife who could be the new teacher. The new minister and his wife were a young, good-looking couple, still in their honeymoon. Everyone liked them and invited them to tea. And liked Mrs. Allen immediately. She's taking our class until the new teacher, Miss Daisy, arrives. She says we can ask her any question we like, and I ask her lots. I'm good at asking questions, Marilla. I believe you, said Marilla. We must have Mr. and Mrs. Allen up to tea sometime soon, she added. Oh yes, said Anne. And may I make a cake? Yes, you may, promised Marilla. Marilla and Anne prepared for tea all Monday and Tuesday. Made a great deal of food. Marilla wanted to give Mr. and Mrs. Allen the best tea of any family in the village. Wednesday morning came. Anne got up very early because she was too excited to sleep. After breakfast, she made her cake. The cake came out of the oven looking perfect. Can I put flowers from the garden on the table? Asked Anne. Mrs. Barry had flowers on her table, she added cleverly, and the minister told her it looked lovely. Well, do as you like, said Marilla. The minister and their wife arrived, and they all enjoyed a lovely tea. Everything went well until Anne's cake was passed around. Oh, you must take a piece of this, Mrs. Allen, said Marilla. Anne made it just for you. In that case, I must try it, laughed Mrs. Allen. She took a mouthful and a strange look came onto her face. Marilla tried hers and said, Anne, what on earth is in this cake? Oh, isn't it all right? Cried Anne. It's terrible. What flavoring did you use? Vanilla, said Anne. Go and bring me the bottle of vanilla you used. Anne returned with a small bottle labeled vanilla. Marilla took it and smelled it. Anne, you flavored that cake with medicine. I broke a bottle of medicine last week and poured the rest of it in this old vanilla bottle. Couldn't you smell it? Anne burst into tears and ran to her room. Lying on her bed, she heard somebody coming. Oh, Marilla, cried Anne, without looking up. It's terrible. Mrs. Allen will think I tried to poison her. My little dear girl, don't cry, said a happy voice. Anne jumped up to find Mrs. Allen standing by the bed. It's just a funny mistake that anybody might make. But I wanted to make a nice cake for you. Thank you, dear. But now, will you show me your flower garden? I love flowers. Anne showed Mrs. Allen her flower garden and soon felt much better. No more was said about the cake. When Mr. and Mrs. Allen left, Anne turned to Marilla. Marilla, isn't it nice to think that tomorrow is a new day with no mistakes in it yet? Yes, that was Anne of Green Gables. Perhaps I will read a little more. I will do a cozy book corner 2. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed Anne listening to this story. It's a classic loved by millions of people around the world. It's one of the great work of literature. Have a nice day or a nice night. Sleep well. Enjoy yourself. Take care.